This is a co-work with my former student and my colleague, and this is about business groups. And if I may go through the literature on the business group, these are some of the questions that we've been asking, like disparity between control and cash flow rights. What's the valuation effect of this disparity? People have looked at how business groups are formed, how they are structured. And there are lots of studies on internal capital markets, and another large body of literature on tunneling. But this is not what I'm going to look at. What I want to do is I will divide what is inside the business group and what is outside the business group. And my interest is what influence business groups would impose upon firms outside of the business group. So, and the reason is obvious, right? Because we care about the entire economy. We do not care only about the business group, what happens inside the business group. We care about the entire economy, so we should pay attention to what happens outside of the business group. So this is what we are looking at, right? Business group firms and non-business group firms. And there could be many channels how business group firms can influence non-business group firms. Obviously, we can think about the product market. That would be the study research topic for IO people. Factor market, there's labor. Labor market is an important issue. And here in this paper, I'm not going to be too ambitious. I'm just going to focus on capital, right? And the basic research question is the following, right? So again, business group firms, non-business group firms. And if the capital market is large, here large means not just about size, it means that the degree of investor protection is high enough so that the companies, the issuing firms would reliably pledge, right? Pledge to return back the cash flow to the investors. And if that is the case, the financial market, the capital market will be well developed. And so whenever there is a positive NPV project, you can easily raise capital and invest, right? So in that economy, business group firms will be able to raise capital without much friction. They would invest. Also, non-business group firms, they would also be able to raise capital easily because they can pledge perfectly, almost perfectly, and they could also invest. But if the capital market is underdeveloped, maybe because of investor protection level is so low, you cannot pledge, market participants do not trust the companies, what happens? Well, in this case, still, business group firms, for some reason, which I will explain in a moment, can still raise capital, and they will be able to invest. But these non-business group firms, they will not be able to do so. Raise capital, they cannot, so they cannot invest. So my research question is, in this setup, the second state, when the capital market is small, underdeveloped, what happens if the strength and the dominance of business groups is so high? Will they be able to harm investment efficiency of non-business group firms? That's the research topic that I'm looking at. I will be using Korean data, and there are a number of reasons why I do so. First, in Korea, you may know only about household names like Samsung and Hyundai, Korean chaebols, but Korean chaebols are not the only firms that exist in Korea. There are many non-business group firms around, so we have a very balanced composition of business group firms and non-business group firms, which will allow us to answer our research question, right? Another one is there's a very nice structural break during our history, the Asian crisis. I will show you in a moment, but there's a fundamental change in the financial market. What we had before the crisis and what we had after the crisis is very different. The financial market is much more developed. Investor protection is relatively higher after the crisis. So this will allow us to test the one that we have shown here. Large capital market, well-developed and underdeveloped capital market. And then also another reason is the data. We have very detailed ownership data for many, many years. And another one is, if you take a look at Korean firms, not just non-business group firms, but also business group firms. For example, Samsung Group, for example, they have around 60 member firms, but there are only 20 publicly listed firms. The rest, remaining 40 companies are non-listed, privately held companies. But we need the data. But unfortunately, we do. In Korea, if the company size is above a certain threshold, they are subject to external audit, which means that their financial data, financial statement data is fairly reliable. So that is the reason why we'll be using Korean data. And this various line chart, time charts show you the structural break. So the top two is the size of the stock market, bond market rising, and foreign ownership much higher in later years after the crisis, Asian crisis, 98 and 98, 97 and 98. And the one in the middle is also very interesting. This shows you net savings by corporations and the households. And you can see that net savings of the corporations are rising dramatically after crisis, and the net savings of the households are falling. I think this is somewhat worldwide phenomena. This is also the case in Korea, which means that corporations are have made a lot of profit. They're also piling up those earnings in the form of cash. They have enough money. And also the yield is falling, debt to equity ratio is falling. So if they want, they can even borrow more. And also the cash holdings are very, very high. So this is showing you that there's not much of a financial constraint when it comes to large business groups. So these are the detailed questions that I will be asking in my paper, the hypothesis. The first hypothesis is just to check whether there was any regime change before and after the crisis. So I do a child test, and I found out that it was the Asian crisis that changed, especially financial constraint. Firms had a lot of financial constraint before the crisis, but it's much more relieved afterward. But that's not the main hypothesis. The main hypothesis is the second one, negative externality. Does the size and the dominance and the strength of business groups, will they have negative externality on investment efficiency of non-business group firms? By the way, I do this at the industry level. I will show you the industry level analysis. That's my baseline regression, but I do have a robustness check where I use firm level regressions. This negative externality, what I do subsample tests, I show that this will get mitigated after the Asian crisis when the financial market will be much more well developed, investor protection is higher. And also I look at the collaterals, how much internal capital the firm has, and try to, and we'll show you that again, this external negative externality would be mitigated. And I also see in hypothesis 3 whether this inferior investment efficiency will translate into lower profitability. And lastly, I run a hazard model. Here, hazard means making large investment. I will show you that if there is a strong influence by the business groups, these non-business group firms, the hazard of making investment will be lower. Okay, so that's what I will be showing. And the size of the capital market, financial constraint, yes. So this is a story showing you why business group firms will not be subject to financial constraint even if the country's capital market is underdeveloped, right? So this is not my own idea. This is from Almeida and Wolfenson. So let's say that there are 3 companies, M, L, and H. They stand for productivity. The level of productivity is highest for firm H. Medium is in the middle, and low is L is low. If they're all separate firms, firm L, which has low productivity, instead of making investment on its own, it's better, you can actually make more money by providing capital to firm H, right? But if M and L forms a business group, that's not what's going to happen. If the capital market is not well developed, so we do not have perfect pledgeability, right? Business group would matter, right? So once you form a business group, you're under the same chairman, there's no information asymmetry, you can trust each other, then firm L, instead of providing capital to firm H, which you should not trust, right, outsider, you should trust M. And even if the productivity is lower than H, it's better off by giving money to firm M. So So this is why business groups, they will be forming an internal capital market. So this is basic internal capital market. And the larger the internal capital market, the business group will be able to finance good projects, and they would enjoy efficient investment allocation, capital allocation. And then there's another story, banks, right? Banks, what would they do if the capital market is not well developed, capital is scarce? Well, if they have a choice between lending it out to business groups or standalone loan firms, firm H, they would probably give the money to the business group first. A number of reasons. One, sister companies can always do debt guarantee. There's also a political connection story, and there's also a too big to fail problem. So it's better off by just blindly lending to the business group firm. So even if the state of the economy, even though the capital market is not well developed, business groups will still be able to enjoy, investment efficiency. They will be able to raise capital, but firm H, the standalone firm, will not. Now I need to measure how strong, how dominant the business groups are for each of the industry. And I think there are two dimensions, okay? One has to do with market share. So I will have this element in my measure. And not only market share, but who has a large market share? There will be a difference between a very large business group having a 10% market share in a certain industry and a very small business group having the same 10% market share in the industry. They will be different because as we have seen earlier, right, the size of the business group would matter. They would have, it would be easier for them to raise capital compared to firms outside the business group. As they take away the capital, the non-business groups will be deprived, and they will not be able to make efficient investment. So we have two dimensions right here. So we have industry. Now, initially, it is populated with non-business group firms. And then there's a business group coming along, penetrating in the market. And obviously, the case when they have a greater market share, in that case, they will deprive capital away from the non-business group firms. That's one thing. And another one is, even if they have the same market share, if the size of the business group is large, again, they would be able to steal capital away from the non-business group firms than otherwise. So we have two dimensions, and we'll be making use of these two. And this is my index. I named it as BSDI, Business Group Strength and Dominance. Here, dominance is picking up market share. It's representing market share. And strength is representing the size of the internal capital market. So it is industry level measure, K is the industry. And if you look at the parenthesis term, the denominator is just aggregate sales by business groups and aggregate sales by non-business groups. And in the numerator, you can see the aggregate sales by the business groups. And I interact that with a weight, and the weight is the relative size of the internal capital market. And this one is the relative size. The denominator is just the sum of all the ICMs across all the business groups in that industry. And this is just a scaling factor to make BSDI between 0 and 1. Okay. And then the size of the internal capital market, that's something that I need to measure. I don't think there's an obvious way to measure this. And what I do is I try many measures. And this is one measure that I'll be doing. I will simply add all the assets of the member firms inside the same business group. Okay? That's just one way of doing it. Why? Because I think every element of the asset in a company can be used to provide capital to your sister firms. Loans and equity, this is direct, right? Giving loans to your sister companies, injecting capital to your sister companies, that's a direct way. This could be the narrow measure of internal capital market. But also PP&E. This can be also used to support your sister companies. So let's say that you are, increasing your PP&E. This will increase your sales, but if you want to increase sales, you also need to increase purchases of intermediate goods and parts and so on. And the question is, who are you going to buy from? Well, you can buy from your sister companies, and this is exactly related party transaction. and you can support your sister companies. What about cash and equivalents? You cannot directly use this to support, but it could always transform into loans and equity that can go into your sister companies and also PP&E to support sister companies through related part transactions. So I use all of them. And then I have a narrow measure, which is only looking at cash and cash equivalents, which other papers in the literature have used. And this is the data. You can see the time period, 1987 to 2010, 24 years of data. So this is as far as I can go back. I want to go back even more far away, but this is all I have, 1987. But this is good enough because the structural break in my paper will take place in 1997. So we have sufficient data before the structural break and also sufficient data afterward. Okay, let me skip this part. And you can see that all my variables, baseline variables, are industry level variables. CapEx ratio is going to be my measure of investment. And because I am running investment efficiency regression, I need a measure to capture growth opportunity, investment opportunity. And because many of my firms, sample firms, are privately held companies, I'll be using sales growth instead of Tobin's Q. I do have a robustness check part, which we're using industry level Tobin's Q. I can show you that later. You can see Tobin's Q there. I also try intangible ratio. I also try value added growth and so on. This is the BSDI. It shows you how it changed over time. It does not show you the cross-sectional variation for a given year, but I guarantee you there's a huge variation within a given year. And also there's a time variation. This is the first result, efficiency improving after the crisis. So this is not the main hypothesis. This is just trying to show you that there was a regime shift, right? So you can see before the crisis, after the crisis, and industry sales growth, that's the growth opportunity. You do not see a significant coefficient there, but you see instead a significant coefficient on operating cash flow. So, you know, it's an indication of inefficient capital allocation, but afterward, it flips. Much stronger coefficient on growth opportunity, insignificant coefficient on operating cash flows. And if you interact, you can see that the interaction term is also significant. And I do a structural break test and ran the same regression at different periods, different subperiods, and I do find that the difference is the greatest when we have subsample before the crisis and after the crisis. And then this one shows you that the improvement in investment allocation, capital allocation, is mostly found in non-business group firms. You do not see much happening in the business group firms. And also another thing to note is that investment was fairly efficient even before the crisis for business group firms. Again, consistent with our story. And then we now first introduce BSDI. So what happens then? The same regression, investment efficiency regression, we plug in BSDI and we are going to interact that with the right-hand side variables. And we don't see anything for the interaction term between BSDI, the strength and dominance of business groups in the industry, and growth potential, investment opportunity. We don't see anything. Because this is the full sample, we are including business group firms and non-business group firms, which means that BSDI, even if business groups get enlarged, it does not harm the economy. It doesn't do anything good to the economy when it comes to investment efficiency. But if you focus on non-business group firms, you can see something taking place. So here are the interaction terms again. Before the crisis, negative, significant. BSDI is harming investment efficiency of non-business group firms. After crisis, it disappears. And the difference is also significant. And this is the year-by-year regression. So this is the coefficient on the interaction term. Industry sales multiplied by BSDI. You can see that it was negative before the crisis, but it's positive after the crisis. And then we do a lot of subsample tests to see whether there is any mitigating effect. We look at tangibility. how much tangible assets does the firm have out of total assets. And obviously, if the firm does not have a lot of tangible assets, you cannot provide collateral, you cannot borrow from a bank. So you will see more negative externality taking place. And you can see that there before the crisis, but nothing happening after the crisis. And this is high tangibility, you don't see anything, okay? Even if, all right, so subsample test. I also do it for operating cash flows. If you have enough operating cash flow, if you don't, you're harmed. And if you have high cash flows, you're not harmed. And so I think this should be my last slide. Endogenating, right? So far what I have been saying is that market share, ICM, large internal capital market would affect capital expenditure of non-business group firms. But there could be some reverse causality stories. What if this, non-business group firms are not investing, even though they should, and this void is being captured by business group firms? It's not business group firms stealing capital from them. It's just that non-business group firms are just lazy. They're not doing their investment. Well, that's a valid argument, but we show that this negative externality takes place only before the crisis, but it disappears after the crisis. This argument cannot explain why there is such a difference. Another one is about the ICM, internal capital market. The reverse causality story says that if non-business group firms do not invest, somehow business groups in the same industry would enlarge their internal capital market. This is very implausible, right? Because my measure of internal capital market is the assets, the sum of the assets of the member firms. To increase the ICM, what you have to do is you have to increase other member firm sizes or acquire another firm, right? Why would they do that? Just because non-business group firm is not investing in some particular industry. So I think this is an impossible story, and I think we can make use of this ICM as a part of the BSDI that is reasonably exogenous to the investment being made by non-business group firms. So what I do is I decompose BSDI into two parts. That's the one I decompose into. ICM size is the one that I want to focus on, and the interaction term is stronger for the ICM, the size of the business group, which is less subject to endogenated problem, I think. I should stop here, right? Okay, thank you.
Thank you. So now we'll have as the discussant Alexander Wagner.
Great. So as you see, I actually have a logo of Keio University here because I'm actually at the moment visiting Tokyo, and I can recommend it to anybody. It's fantastic to live in Tokyo. I've been doing this for a couple of years now, and it's great to come back, not only for the food, but also for the food. I should also do a disclaimer. I'm actually not working in the area of business groups, but I was still very happy to be assigned to discuss this paper because it's something that's also a topical issue here in Japan. So Wuchan explained well, I think, what the paper is about. Let me try to give a brief wrap-up, sort of how I understand the paper as a non-expert in the business group area, and then talk a little bit about what I think one could do with the paper. So there's lots of studies that look at differences between business group and non-business group firms in how they allocate capital. We know a lot about that. There's also quite different results in the literature, but we know anyways too little, I agree with that claim, about how that affects firms outside the business group, right? So one of the reasons why there are differences between business group and non-business group firms may be that there's an external effect of the business group firms on the other ones. And so this paper here asks two key questions. There are more, but the two key questions are, can firms without group affiliations efficiently allocate capital when there's a bully in town, so to speak, when there is a big group that actually affects capital allocation? And then also, does that depend on how well the external capital market is working? And so the paper provides the following answers to this. So in an industry where the top 30 business groups are very dominant, the bullies, I'll call them that. In that industry, in that time, that's where the firms that are not part of those top 30, they allocate capital less efficiently as measured by how strongly they respond to sales growth in their capital expenditures. We'll talk about whether that's a useful measure, but that's what the paper does. And this effect exists only in the pre-97-98 period, which is a proxy for investor protection, the authors argue. Okay, so this is the key table, in my view. Let's check this out. So here our dependent variable is the industry CapEx ratio. All of this is on the industry level. And the dependent variables here, this is just measured for the non-large business group firms. I'm actually a little confused because in the presentation you had non-business group firms up here, but in the paper it's non-large business group firms, which is a difference. It includes business groups, but just not the top 30. So we have to clarify that. Maybe I misunderstood, but that's my reading. These are firms, business group and non-business group firms outside the top 30 of the large groups. And so we're looking at before 97, after 90, and after 98, and we see that after 98, the non-large business groups firms start reacting to industry sales growth in their capital allocation decisions. So that's consistent with the hypothesis, these are affected by the bullies in town, so to speak. These are affected by the capital market. They are affected most strongly pre-1997 by the BSD index, by the notion that if there is a powerful set of business groups in the industry where you are, that hampers your ability to allocate capital efficiently. And that's happening only in the pre-1997 period. If you look at the whole sample, then the triple interaction term is what matters. It's just borderline significant, but I think that's okay. All right. So in this discussion, I want to put the paper into what I think is the relevant literature. Of course, the authors know much better about this, but I benefited from reading ECGI's survey on this, so I want to talk a little bit about how I see the contribution of this paper, and then I have some clarification ideas and comments for the empirical stuff. So about the literature, there's a long literature, starting maybe with this paper in the QJE by Hoshi Kashyap and Darishafstein, that looks at firms in business groups, how they allocate capital versus firms that are not in business groups. This is for the Japanese keiretsu, where basically they find that firms in the keiretsu are much less sensitive to cash flow because they can finance themselves. They don't suffer from the fact that they depend on cash flow. Okay. Then there's another paper a little later by Shin and Park that does this for South Korean business groups. So now we're getting closer to the sample that the authors look at, where they find that these business group firms are very sensitive to growth opportunities, as they should be, whereas the non-business group firms are not so sensitive, but very sensitive to cash flow. Okay. And so one way, and this paper has a big discussion about whether that's efficiency or not, and I think that's a different topic, but I think one way to talk about the present paper is to say, why does this arise? Why does this arise that the non-business group firms act differently than the other ones? And the author's question, I think that has some compelling idea, is that there's an external effect. And I love the presentation because it was graphically and visually very appealing to me. There's these two fields and one has an external effect on the other. And the literature hasn't combined those two yet. So I like the idea. Okay, so this is what I just said. I'm a little unclear on where you stand on whether the fact that the business groups react so strongly to growth, whether that's efficient or not. Some of the literature argues that they overreact, but that's not your topic. You motivate the paper with Almeida and Wolfensohn. I have little time, so I'm just going to keep this a sort of blanket claim. I'm not sure you're doing yourself a big service by doing this, because my reading of this paper is that it's actually about why do business groups arise in the first place, and who selects themselves into business groups. And you say nothing about why certain firms are in a business group or not. The E word is floating around here, and I'm not going to even talk about the notion that there is a reason why some firms are in a business group and others aren't. And I think that's at least how I read Alameda Wolfensohn, more in that direction, rather than talking about the external capital market as you do. So I'm not sure that that's strategically wise to position yourself there, but that's up to you, of course. On to the empirical design. So this is the index, this BSD index, strength and dominance, the bully index. One thing I sort of had trouble with a little bit is how exactly should I think about this multiplicative term here? On the one hand, you argue these two things, strength and dominance, so size of the internal capital market and market share, these two are inseparable. That's why we multiply them with each other. But then later on, at the end of your presentation, you run a linear regression trying to take the two apart. And I have trouble putting those two under one heading. Those seem to be incompatible to me. So the results are driven by the size of the internal capital market, and that's interesting. I like that. It's a plausible thing, but maybe I'm a little slow here, but I see a little bit of a tension here. The capital market status, so your key result is driven by this dummy variable, pre-97, post-98. That's plausible to me. I was hoping you have a little bit more opportunity in having variation within those two time periods. The graphs you showed at the beginning of your presentation, they show that, for example, foreign ownership does fluctuate over time, even post-1998. And so international capital flows could indicate time variation in access to capital for firms that have growth opportunities. And so that would be really cool if you can tease that out a bit more. I've talked about this top 30 and just below top 30 business, and forgive me if I misunderstood. I'm just going to say what I understood from the paper. There's a big difference, the literature argues, between the top 30 groups and everybody else. There are more than just 30 business groups. And the literature, which you're building on, and that's fine, says let's just call the top 30 the business groups. But in your particular application, putting number 31 into the non-business group or non-large business group thing may be confounding effects. So I would like to see effects for the really independent firms that are not part of a business group. And I was hoping you could, at least in a supplementary appendix for sort of ignorant readers like myself who don't know so much about Korea, show me, are they really different at point 30 to number 31? Are they really different? You run regressions on the industry level, and the argument you give for this is that if we used firm-level data, our results would be primarily driven by firms that may not be individually significant in the economy. I sympathize with the notion, but I think it's a little non-standard. And as I say here, it mixes the concern for the aggregate welfare with actually finding something that's true or not true for all individual firms, or on average for firms. You do run the profitability regressions on the firm level, but not the main results. So you mentioned you have weighted least squares results that are qualitatively similar. I couldn't find them in the paper. I think readers will long for those results, at least this reader longs for seeing those results. And if on average you don't find such strong results, I don't think that's a big problem. I'm really a firm believer in heterogeneity among firms. So I think these non-affiliated firms, they differ on dimensions which will allow them to more or less ably deal with the bully in town. Right? If you have a strong CEO, an experienced CEO, good governance, whatever, I'm not sure this is certainly not an exhaustive list, but it would be really cool to understand, well, what allows a small firm that's in an industry dominated by a top 30 business group, what allows them to survive and to attract capital? So I would rephrase the question a little bit in that direction. All right, okay, what else do we have? So running capital expenditure regressions on past sales growth, I know lots of literature does that. Capital expenditures are relevant in some industries, not in others. Maybe employee growth is more relevant for service-oriented firms, right? They hire more employees if they think there's going to be more to sell later on. So that would be something to perhaps think about. And I have never done work like this myself, I have to say, but to me it seems a bit odd to try to say I should invest more when past sales growth has been high. It's like I'm too late to the party. I want to have something that's forward-looking. You have reasons to not look at Tobin's Q. We might buy them, especially post Tony Whitehead's work, but having some sort of forward-looking measure, perhaps being as bold as looking at option prices from another country for a certain industry, it could perhaps be something worth looking into. I know this is sort of is dreaming aloud here, but I'm not really so happy with a past-oriented past-oriented sales growth view. Okay. We can talk about Tobin's Q a bit more. I have some additional ideas about this. And then finally, maybe on the measurement, I know I'm being a pain here, but so you measure sales growth, if I understand correctly, in your industry-level regressions. Your key driving variable is sales growth of the median firm in the whole sample. So that seems to be one of the small firms, because there's many of them. I'm not sure that's going to be representative for what we would like to usually call industry sales growth. Right? If that's a measure of the industry's growth options, I mean, for sure, the smaller firms are going to be very different. They've just started out than what the representative firm that we want to look at is. Okay, sample splits, we can talk about those myself. I have some painful smaller points. I apologize for those, but we'll talk about those individually. So in my view, this is an interesting take on sort of big literature looking at this external effects of business group firms on non-business group or smaller business group firms. I like that basic idea. I have some quibbles with the existing empirical analysis, but I hope you can address those or brush them aside. Anyways, best of success with the paper, and thanks to the organizers for a very nice conference. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Now we'll open up the floor. We have about 15 minutes for questions. Yeah, Gerard?
Yeah, I would follow the discussant indication to understand better what goes on in the non-business group sample. I presume in Korea there are affiliates of multinationals, say the General Electric branch. And so that branch is likely to benefit from the internal capital market of General Electric, as well for the dominance of General Electric. I wonder how you treat this and whether it shows up in your results.
Okay, I haven't looked into that one, multinationals. It must be there, but probably not many. I will look into it. Thank you.
Yeah, Gerard?
Could you tell us something about the allocation of state subsidies compared to the two type of firms?
Allocation of?
The role of state subsidies, whether the state supports financially. I mean, you might have financial and non-financial support, and I was wondering whether it would be different for the business groups and the non-business group firms.
Oh, yes. So you're talking about government subsidies. I haven't looked at it. And that could be one reason why business group firms would not face financial constraint before the Asian crisis. I know that government subsidies no longer exist in Korea. We are at the WTO system. It would be against the trade agreements, but it did exist before the crisis. But that would only help out large business group, because most of the policy loans and subsidies went to those Korean chaebols, not non-business group firms. But I haven't looked at it yet. Thank you.
Oh.
No, sorry. Okay. Thanks. I wanted to hear what how you think about an efficient allocation of capital across firms. I think the regressions implicitly assume that you want the allocation of CapEx across firms in an industry to be as strongly correlated with Q or sales growth as possible. That it's always better that the slope is high. If you kind of take that all the way, it means that the highest Q firm in every industry should optimally undertake all CapEx in that industry. Okay, so we're saying the optimal, socially optimal CapEx in the car industry is that Tesla should make all the investment, right? So we don't believe that. We don't think that's efficient because we think there's marginally declining productivity of capital. So the firm that has the highest average does not have all the investment opportunities. So it might be that you have some reason to think that we're always on the side, of too little correlation, and then in practice your regressions are fine. But I think you need to think a little bit about it and maybe motivate it a little bit, or think of alternative measures that you're more sure of capture efficiency.
Yes, I agree with your comment. So because my key main measure of investment opportunity is sales growth, right? The firm that has been growing should be investing more, and they would take over all the industry. That would be that could be a suboptimal solution. I do have some other measures of investment opportunity which I do use in the paper. I do use industry Thomas Q, which has a problem of its own, as we all know. And I use industry level value added, which is coming from the United Nations Statistical Office, and also use intangible assets, the fractional intangible assets. They all give the same result. So maybe that would slightly respond to your concern. I'm not sure, but still it's better than just showing sales growth, more investment, which is Tesla taking over everything, doing more investment.
Okay. Yeah, Jeff? Jeffrey. Yeah.
So building on this point, if I were you to look at capital allocation, I would try to follow some recent influential work by Fung and Xie. That is, that they look at the differences in productivity between firms in an industry to evaluate how well capital is allocated. And if the mechanism for capital allocation is working, you would expect that high productivity firms are investing more, have more capex, and employ more people. So that approach is structural, but there is a recent paper of Gordon Phillips forthcoming in the Journal of Finance that has a less structural version of this methodology. That might be a more direct way to answer your question.
Okay, so you're saying that put productivity, measure productivity on the right-hand side and see whether that will lead to more investment.
So the dependence variable is the investment or the change in employment. And then you would think that the most productive firms with higher total factor productivity invest more and employ more people.
Okay, we'll talk.
Yeah.
Jeff?
So maybe this is a little orthogonal, but is the implication of what you've shown here that the World Bank was right, that in fact the governance regime that it imposed was a good thing, irrespective of the fact that it came out of some list of what counted as good governance, is what you're saying, well, actually they were right and Korean governance improved, one. And secondly, was the source of, was this reflected in flows from outside Korea, international investors, or affected by flows within Korea?
You're talking about investor protection laws? Yeah, exactly. I think it's both. So after the crisis, IMF and the World Bank, they were giving a lot of recommendation, and especially some of the loans and credits were tied to some.
No, but a lot of folks have said that the World Bank, that they were not necessarily right in their, I mean, that they were, it was a transplant of U.S. governance norms that did not necessarily map onto the local economies. And so is one way to understand your paper, a claim about, in fact, that the transplant did work, that improved the efficiency of the governance institutions. And so does it weigh, I mean, from somebody who's a little bit outside of your particular question, it seems to me that one way to understand your work is positive evidence for the ability of a transplant system of governance to improve outcomes.
I think overall, the prescription given by the World Bank and others were right, but they were not 100% right. There are some things that they want beyond, and there are some cases that it didn't work out. But overall, I think it did good than bad. And we are, I mean, when it comes to corporate governance, you cannot just let the market do the work, because corporate governance is in part about power. And people who have power will not change. And a little bit of a push was, I think it was necessary at the time.
So Professor Kim.
Actually, my question has been covered by Jeff's question, but I will, ask you anyway. You seem to assume that the before the crisis, the Korean capital market was underdeveloped, and after the crisis, it's developed. And we did, change some laws, and other than that, actually not much change. And I mean, one significant change is, these big business firms have become more cautious in making investment decisions. That's for sure. But how did you come to the conclusion that assumption that the Korean capital market is now developed?
So I did show you a number of line charts, time charts, showing you that the capital market is large enough, liquid enough to provide capital to whoever has a nice project. The yield is much lower. Corporations have much more cash in their vault. There are foreign investors out there. There are two components in my paper. I look at financial sector development, and I also look at investor protection. I think investor protection is what I think you have in mind. Capital market has been much more developed. I think there's not much of a dispute on that. But when it comes to investor protection, there is an improvement. If you focus on what happened, what was the practice before the crisis. But if you just try to compare what is happening right now in Korea with other companies in other developed countries, the way we practice is very poor. That I don't deny. But in relative terms, I think there was improvement, and I think that's being picked up empirically in this paper.
Yupana?
Two small points. The first one, I'm not sure whether it's a good idea. You're looking at top 30 groups versus the rest of the groups, and you call them independent firms. But I think maybe the top 10 groups already dominate more than 100% of Korea GDP, and the rest maybe little tiny groups. Maybe I think you want to group them differently. Okay. And second point. I think you have fantastic data set, and it's beautiful to look at a lot of things. And you seem to I like the idea of looking at the way the large firms like Samsung abuse of other little firms, right? The basic concept with a large business group have a lot of market power. And can you look at exit and entry of small firms, say when Samsung entered the market, and whether these affect other firms, push other firms to exit or block other people to enter? I think more direct evidence of what you want to do. Thank you.
Yes, so this is related to Alexander's comment, my definition of large business group against non-large business groups. I sometimes use the word business groups instead of using the word large. This has to do with the regulation Korean government imposes. What they do is the Fair Trade Commission, they designate business groups according to the size of the assets they command. And they call that large business group. And the definition has been changing. In the old days, it was top 30, and then they have this numerical threshold. If you're above this threshold, you're all large business group, and so on. So I had to come up with a consistent measure, and I decided to use top 30. And it is true that the 31st largest business group will not be so much different from the top 30. Maybe one robustness check is leave out all the other large business group that has ever been designated by the Fair Trade Commission, but not in the top 30, and compare with all the others. That could be one thing. And it is true that in recent years, top 10 is really dominating, but that was not the case in the very old days, like in the 1980s. So I think I would keep top 30, but yeah, yes. So, I mean, top 10 was not as large as what they are right now in the old days. Yes, I will try to show it to you. Another comment you had is entry and exit. Actually, there is another paper using French data. They look at entry and exit of firms affiliated to a business group. And those firms that enter the industry affiliated to a business group, and this business group has large cash holdings, they will perform better. So this is a very similar paper as mine. And they already look at entry. So that's why I'm not looking at it. I focus on some other parts of some other hypothesis, which they do not do.